The wind bit at my exposed cheeks, a steady, relentless gnaw that had long since numbed any sensation. My breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a brief, visible defiance against the vast, indifferent cold. I hunched deeper into my parka, the thick fabric a poor shield against the biting reality of the frozen lake shore. The ice under my heavy boots groaned a low, guttural protest with every step, a sound that always managed to settle deep in my bones, vibrating with an ancient, uneasy hum. I kept my gaze fixed on the horizon where the last vestiges of a sickly orange sun were bleeding out into a bruise-purple sky. The light was fading fast, and with it my window for discovery. My determination was a knot in my gut, tighter than any cold could make it. I had to find it. I had to, it's not right, under the ice. The sender, a colleague, had vanished shortly after. No body, no trace, just that panicked, garbled recording. The local authorities had dismissed it as a prank, a cry for attention, but I knew better. I knew the look in my colleague's eyes the last time we spoke, the frantic energy, the desperate need to be believed. For weeks, I'd been coming here, trekking across the desolate landscape, ignoring the warnings of the few locals who lived in the scattered cabins miles inland. They spoke of bad omens, of the lake's ancient hunger, of things best left undisturbed. I'd always scoffed at such superstitions, a person of logic, of empirical evidence. But out here, on this desolate expanse of ice and rock, logic felt thin, fragile, easily shattered by the sheer, overwhelming emptiness. My headlamp, a powerful beam against the encroaching gloom, swept across the jagged surface of the ice, picking out frozen ripples, trapped bubbles, and the occasional branch of a skeletal tree. I moved slowly, methodically, scanning every inch, my eyes straining for anything that didn't belong, anything that wasn't just ice, rock, or dead wood. A glint caught my eye, a shard of something unnatural protruding from a crack in the ice just a few yards from the water's edge. My heart didn't pound, it simply stopped, then resumed with a heavy, deliberate thud. This wasn't the usual panicked reflex, it was a deeper, more primal recognition of something profoundly wrong. I approached cautiously, the crunch of my boots on the thin layer of fresh snow covering the ice the only sound for miles. It wasn't metal, it lacked the telltale sheen. It wasn't stone, there were no visible grain lines, no imperfections. It was a matte, obsidian black, absorbing the last dim light rather than reflecting it. It was a perfect, unyielding plane, cutting through the jagged ice with an almost surgical precision. As I got closer, I saw that it wasn't just a shard. It was a vast, geometric slab, mostly buried beneath the thick layer of ice. Only a corner of it was exposed, forming a sharp, acute angle that defied the natural curves and chaos of the frozen lake shore. It seemed to stretch down into the depths, an alien intrusion into this otherwise pristine, brutal landscape. My colleague's voice echoed, clearer now in my mind, under the ice. I knelt, chipping away at the ice around the exposed edge with the small geological hammer I carried. The ice fractured easily, but the slab itself was unyielding. It felt ancient, not just old, but timeless. My headlamp beam danced over its surface. There were no markings, no etchings, no discernible features, just that flawless, light-devouring black. It was so utterly featureless that it was terrifying. What was it? Who could have placed it here? The scale of it, even from the small exposed section, suggested something enormous buried deep beneath the lake. Driven by an urge I couldn't quite name, a morbid curiosity mingled with a desperate need for answers, I reached out. My gloved fingers brushed against the smooth, frigid surface. Instead, it was like a sudden, silent exhalation. Not a breath of air, but a vacuum pulling something from within me. My vision blurred, the familiar landscape of the frozen lake shore rippling like a disturbed reflection. The bruise-purple sky above seemed to stretch infinitely, not just upwards, but inwards, folding in on itself. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, a silent scream building in my skull, not with a sound I could hear, but with a sensation of knowing. A vast, impossible knowing. It wasn't a voice or a thought, but a crushing, undeniable awareness of scale. I wasn't just on a frozen lake. I was a speck, a fleeting flicker in an incomprehensibly vast, indifferent mechanism. My hand recoiled as if burned, though there was no heat. The slab wasn't just a strange object. It was a window, a conduit to something immense and utterly alien, something that had been patiently waiting, silent and unseen, beneath the ice, and I had just touched it. My colleague hadn't been wrong, they had just discovered something too big for the world. Parature. It felt like something older, deeper. My breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a cloud of white against the pale, bruised sky. The small geological hammer felt inadequate, a child's toy against something so profoundly, stubbornly embedded. I struck again, a sharp, precise blow just where a hairline fissure had begun to spiderweb. The ice cracked with a sound like splintering bone, a high, brittle report that echoed across the silent expanse of the frozen lake shore. I pulled back, my shoulders aching from the sustained effort. My fingers, despite the thick insulation of my gloves, were growing numb. It wasn't just the cold, it was the peculiar quality of the cold emanating from the slab itself. It felt wrong, a pervasive chill that seemed to seep into the marrow, bypassing the usual defenses of skin and muscle. It felt ancient, like the bedrock of the world had decided to shiver. I tried a different approach. I wedged the chisel end of the hammer into the widening crack, then used my weight to leverage it. A groan, deep and resonant, vibrated up through the tool and into my arms. It wasn't the ice groaning. It was the slab, or perhaps the ground beneath it. The sound was too low, too organic. My gut tightened. I paused, listening. The air here was always still, yet always alive with subtle, unsettling noises. The lake itself was a vast, frozen tomb, holding its secrets close beneath layers of impenetrable ice. With renewed resolve, I attacked a different section, focusing on a cluster of smaller, intersecting cracks. The ice here was thinner, more brittle. Each strike sent shards skittering across the slick surface. I could feel a subtle give, a fraction of movement. Encouraged, I redoubled my efforts, ignoring the tremor in my hands and the dull ache in my wrists. I wasn't just chipping away ice anymore. I was fighting something, an invisible adversary that held its prize with unyielding grip. Then, with a sudden sharp crack that was louder than all the others, a piece of the ice-encased slab broke free. It wasn't the large, smooth surface I'd been targeting, but a jagged, irregular chunk, roughly the size of my head, that had been wedged against the main mass. It slid across the ice, coming to rest a few feet away, partially obscured by a drift of snow. My breath hitched. I hadn't expected it to give at all, let alone yield a piece. I scrambled over to it, my boots crunching on the packed snow and ice. The piece was mostly covered in a thick rime of ice, but one edge, where it had cleanly fractured, was exposed. I knelt, pushing away the snow, my gloved fingers brushing against the exposed surface. It wasn't rock, it was warm. The warmth was undeniable, a living pulse against my skin. It felt epidermal, organic. It wasn't a clean break like a rock fracturing. It was a tear. The surface was intricately textured, like stretched, taut skin, crisscrossed with delicate, almost microscopic ridges and valleys, and the color, it wasn't the gray or black of stone. It was a deep, muted crimson, almost purple in the dim light, with an unsettling sheen. It looked like something alive. This wasn't geological. This wasn't anything I'd ever encountered in my years studying the Earth's crust. This was alien, not in the sense of outer space, but in the sense of utterly, fundamentally other to anything I understood about the natural world. The warmth intensified slightly under my touch, a subtle throb. I pulled my hand back as if burned, though the object was merely warm. My mind reeled, trying to reconcile the impossible. How could something be frozen solid, encased in ancient ice, yet radiate a living heat? How could it look so biological? I stared at the crimson, pulsing fragment, then back at the impossibly vast, unyielding slab still embedded in the ice. If this small piece was organic, what did that make the whole thing? What colossal, unfathomable thing lay beneath the frozen lake shore, slowly revealing its monstrous truth? I struck again, a sharp, precise blow. The impact wasn't what I expected. Instead of the satisfying crack of ice or the dull thud of rock, a low, resonant hum vibrated through the frozen lake shore. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears alone. It resonated in my teeth, buzzed in my bones, and settled deep in my chest. The hum was almost melodic, yet utterly dissonant, like a forgotten chord struck on an instrument never meant for human hands. The ice around the embedded mass didn't just crack from the impact. It seemed to shiver in response to the vibration, spiderwebbing outwards in intricate, delicate patterns that spread faster than any physical force could dictate. The patterns weren't random. They had a disturbing symmetry, mirroring the strange, non-Euclidean angles I thought I'd glimpsed in the object itself. A sudden, intense pressure built behind my eyes. The world seemed to swim, the sharp edges of the distant pines blurring into a smear of dark green against the gray-white horizon. My vision pulsed, a faint kaleidoscope effect at the periphery of my sight. It was like looking at the world through a sheet of distorted glass, then having that glass vibrate. I stumbled back a step, the geological hammer slipping in my numb fingers, and had to brace myself against the biting wind. The air grew heavier, thick with an unspoken presence. It wasn't just cold anymore, it felt dense, as if the very molecules had become sluggish, reluctant to move. The humming began to subside, fading slowly like a vast, ancient bell being muffled from within. As the last vestiges of the sound died out, the disorienting pressure behind my eyes eased, and the world snapped back into focus, albeit with a clarity that felt almost too sharp, too defined. My gaze was drawn back to the embedded object. The blow had done something, after all. A hairline fracture, thin as a spider silk, now traced a path across its smooth, obsidian-like surface. And at the point of impact, a tiny chip, no bigger than my thumbnail, had flaked away. My fingers, stiff and clumsy, reached for the chip, but then I stopped. My attention was riveted on the fresh wound in the object. Through the minuscule opening, I could see inside. It wasn't solid rock. What I saw defied any material I knew. It was a complex lattice of interwoven strands, fine as threads but strong as steel, pulsing with a faint internal light that was neither white nor colored, but something in between, like captured starlight. The light was incredibly subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, hinting at a deep, intricate network. It was organic, yet utterly alien. There were no cells, no fibers, no familiar biological structures. It was simply pattern. A pattern that seemed to extend into infinite regression, receding into depths that couldn't possibly exist within the confines of the object. My mind struggled to categorize it, to assign it a known form, and failed spectacularly. It was like trying to grasp smoke. This wasn't just some ancient meteorite or geological anomaly. This was something else entirely, something that had been buried here on this desolate frozen lake shore for an unknowable expanse of time, waiting. And now I had woken it. The sheer impossible nature of it twisted my stomach into a knot. I felt a growing certainty that I was seeing something no human was ever meant to witness. The lake, the sky, the very air itself seemed to hold its breath, watching me, waiting for my next move. Instead of the satisfying chip or crack I'd anticipated from the dark, vitreous surface, a low thrumming vibrated up the handle, through my arm, and settled deep in my chest. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears, but felt in my bones, a resonant hum that seemed to emanate not from the object, but through it, as if it were a tuning fork for something vast and unseen. The thrumming intensified, a pressure building behind my eyes, making the delicate bones of my skull ache. The ice beneath my boots on the frozen lake shore began to sing, a high-pitched whine that layered over the deeper vibration. It was a chorus of dread, a sound that felt ancient and wrong. I looked down, my gaze sweeping the immediate vicinity. Tiny, almost imperceptible fissures, like spiderwebs, were spreading from the point where the object pierced the ice. They weren't cracks in the traditional sense. They seemed to grow, extending outward with an organic, almost deliberate slowness, each new filament emitting a faint, silvery glow. A knot formed in my stomach. This wasn't geology. This wasn't anything I had ever encountered in all my years of fieldwork. My scientific training screamed at me to document, to analyze, to understand. But a more primal part of my mind, a part that had no name for this sensation, urged me to run. As I watched, mesmerized and horrified, the surface of the embedded object itself began to change. The smooth, obsidian-like material rippled, not like water, but like muscle contracting under skin. And then slowly, impossibly, a pattern emerged. Not carved, not etched, but forming from within the material, pushing outward. It was a series of concentric circles, impossibly intricate, each line a fractal repetition of the last, spiraling inward to a point of absolute blackness. It wasn't symmetrical, not quite. There was a subtle asymmetry, a wobble, a slight imperfection that made my stomach clench. It looked biological, yet utterly inorganic. My mind struggled to categorize it, to place it within any known framework, and failed. This wasn't a mineral. This wasn't a meteorite. The pattern wasn't static. It seemed to be moving, slowly rotating, drawing my eye deeper into its impossible geometry. It wasn't just a pattern. It was a key or a lock or something that demanded to be understood, even as it defied all understanding. The silver light from the ice fissures intensified, reflecting off the object's now shifting surface, creating an optical illusion that made the entire scene shimmer and distort. The thrumming in my chest became a dull ache, a constant pressure. I needed to break contact. I needed to step back, to regain some semblance of distance and objectivity. But my feet felt rooted to the frozen lake shore, my gaze locked on the rotating, impossible design. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a strange rock. This was active. It was doing something, and I was standing right in the middle of it. Then a distant sound, a crunch of snow, heavy and deliberate, from the tree line to my left. My head snapped up, tearing my eyes away from the hypnotic object. They were waving, a gesture of inquiry, probably wondering what was taking me so long. They were coming. They couldn't see this. They couldn't feel this. I had to stop them, but how? The object was still thrumming, the fissures still growing, the pattern still rotating. It felt like I was standing on the precipice of something vast and ancient, and my colleague was about to walk right into it, oblivious. "Stay back!" I tried to shout, but the words caught in my throat, a dry rasp. The thrumming intensified, vibrating through my jaw, making my teeth chatter. The world seemed to wobble at the edges of my vision. I stumbled backward, my boots scraping on the ice, desperate to create distance, to break the connection, to shield them from whatever this thing was. My hand, still clutching the hammer, felt strangely heavy, as if the object had imbued it with its own impossible weight. The colleague, still too far to hear my strangled cry, continued to approach, a question forming on their lips, their cheerful ignorance a stark contrast to the growing horror that was consuming me on the frozen lake shore. Instead of the satisfying crunch of ice or the dull thunk of dense rock, there was a peculiar, almost gelatinous give, a muted thrum that traveled not just up the handle into my hand, seemed to resonate through the very bones of my arm, echoing somewhere deep behind my eyes. The sound, or lack thereof, was unnerving. It was like striking a massive, silent bell, the vibrations internal rather than external. A low, persistent hum started in my teeth, then spread, filling my skull with a pressure that wasn't pain but a disorienting fullness. My vision blurred at the edges, the crisp white of the snow and the stark blue of the ice shimmering with an unnatural haze. I stumbled back a step, dropping the hammer, which clattered with a surprisingly loud report against the frozen lake shore. The sound was a welcome anchor in the sudden disarray of my senses. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my hands into my temples. The hum persisted, a phantom drone that seemed to emanate from within my own brain. When I opened my eyes again, the world had sharpened, but it also felt thinner. The air was colder, somehow more sterile. The vast expanse of the frozen lake shore, usually a comforting, desolate beauty, now felt like an exposed stage under an indifferent spotlight. My gaze snapped back to the embedded object. The surface, which had been uniformly dark and smooth moments before, now pulsed with a faint internal light, a deep, bruised violet that seemed to ebb and flow beneath the translucent, obsidian-like material. It wasn't a reflection of the sky. It was from within. And where my hammer had struck, a network of incredibly fine, almost invisible lines had appeared, branching out like capillaries across the surface. They weren't cracks, they were patterns. The lines weren't random fractures. They formed intricate geometric designs, not quite fractal, but reminiscent of an impossible non-Euclidean geometry. They were too perfect, too precise to be natural. And as I watched, mesmerized and horrified, the violet light intensified slightly, tracing these new pathways. Then a new sensation. Not a sound, not a visual, but a feeling. It was vast, ancient, and utterly, profoundly lonely. It wasn't my loneliness. It was an echo, a resonance of something that had been waiting dormant for an unimaginable stretch of time. My breath hitched. I stared at the object, my mind reeling. It wasn't just a rock. It was a conduit, a receptor, or perhaps a slumbering consciousness. The lines on its surface continued to glow faintly, a silent testament to the brief, terrifying awakening I had just experienced. My hands trembled as I reached out, stopping just short of touching the object. I could almost hear the faint, high-pitched whine of the wind whipping across the frozen lake shore, but it sounded distant, muffled, as if I were underwater. This wasn't a geological discovery. This was something else entirely, something that threatened to unravel the very fabric of my reality. My initial determination to chip away at it felt childish. Foolhardy, what had I woken? What had I disturbed? The thought settled in my gut like a lead weight. This thing wasn't inert. It had reacted, and now I was certain it was aware. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs stiff and clumsy. But my feet remained rooted to the spot, my gaze locked on the glowing, patterned surface. I wanted to understand, even as every fiber of my being screamed that understanding would be the end of me. The world around me seemed to hold its breath, waiting. And in that waiting, I felt a terrible, inescapable truth begin to crystallize. I was no longer an observer. I was involved. My small, insignificant act of striking the object had woven me into its ancient, incomprehensible narrative. The frozen lake shore, once a place of solitude and scientific pursuit, had become a crucible, and I was trapped within it. Instead of the crisp fracture of rock or the dull thud of frozen earth, the hammer met a surface that yielded, not with a break, but with a sickening, viscous give. It was like striking a frozen, dense membrane or a compacted mass of something utterly alien to the geology I understood. The handle vibrated in my hand, not with the clean recoil of a solid hit, but with a sluggish, sickening tremor that seemed to sink into my bones. I stared at the dark, irregular mass. It wasn't smooth, but textured, like a petrified organ or a knot of ancient, matted roots. The color was an indistinguishable deep charcoal, absorbing the meager light of the late afternoon. It was utterly devoid of reflection, a void in the ice. I tried to scrape at it with the pick end of the hammer, but it offered no purchase. My eyes traced its outline, an oblong, asymmetrical form that seemed to stretch deeper into the ice, disappearing into the opaque depths of the frozen lake shore. A shiver, unrelated to the biting wind, traced its way down my spine. It wasn't volcanic rock. It didn't fit any category I knew. My training, years of meticulous observation and classification, felt like a flimsy shield against the profound wrongness of this thing. Then a faint hum began. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears, not exactly. It was more of a vibration, a low-frequency thrumming that resonated in my skull, a pressure behind my eyes. It started subtly, a barely perceptible tremor, then gradually intensified, growing into a silent roar within my own head. The air around the object seemed to thicken, to shimmer with an unseen energy. I pulled my hand back instinctively, a jolt of alarm shooting through me. The hum intensified, pushing at the boundaries of my perception. It wasn't just a hum. It was data. Not in words, not in images, but in raw, undifferentiated feeling. A crushing weight, an infinite distance, a profound, aching loneliness that wasn't mine, yet felt utterly familiar. It was as if the object was broadcasting not sound waves, but pure, unfiltered sensation directly into my consciousness. I staggered back a step, my head reeling, my hands flying up to cover my ears, though I knew it was useless. The sound was internal. The ice around the object began to shift, not crack, but flow. Like tar, slow and deliberate, the crystalline structure seemed to melt and reform, creating strange, ephemeral patterns that pulsed in time with the silent hum. My breath hitched. This wasn't merely an inert anomaly. It was alive in some unfathomable way, and it was spreading. The loneliness I felt intensified, but now it was tinged with something else, a vast, unthinking hunger. It wasn't malicious, not in any human sense. It was simply consuming. I felt a sudden, dizzying pull, as if my own thoughts were being drawn out of me, siphoned into the expanding network. Memories, fleeting images, fragments of my past, flickered through my mind not as my own recollections, but as if they were being reviewed by an unseen, indifferent intelligence. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This thing wasn't just embedded in the ice. It was embedded in everything. And somehow it was reaching into me. The silent hum was a dialogue, a one-sided conversation where I was the unwilling subject, my very essence being mapped, dissected, understood. It was what it was, and I was standing right in its path. Instead of the crisp, fracturing thwack of rock against rock or the dull clang of metal, there was a sound that vibrated not just in my hand, but deep in my chest. A low, resonant hum, like a forgotten bell rung underwater. My arm recoiled, a jolt of something akin to static electricity tingling up to my shoulder. The hammer, still clutched, felt suddenly heavy, inert. The object itself, a smooth, obsidian-like mass jutting from the frozen lake shore, remained unchanged. Or so I thought. I squinted, leaning closer, my eyes tearing slightly in the biting wind. The surface, which had been uniformly dark and polished, now seemed to shimmer, not with reflected light, but with an inner luminescence that pulsed faintly, like a dying ember deep in its core. What in the? I mumbled, the words snatched by the wind. My determination, which had been a steady flame, flickered. It wasn't geological at all, not in any way I understood. I reached out a gloved finger, hesitating. The hum, though subtle, was still there, a pressure behind my ears. It felt wrong, a frequency my body wasn't designed to perceive. I touched it. The cold was absolute, beyond ice, beyond anything metal. And then, the shimmering intensified. It was an optical illusion, a trick of light and substance, yet it felt utterly real. Patterns emerged, shifting and reforming intricate geometries that made no sense. They weren't carved, they weren't etched. They were part of the surface, moving within it. My heart began a frantic drum against my ribs. This was something else, something awake. I pulled my hand back, a primal instinct screaming at me to run, to leave this place and never look back. But the determined part of User SX, the one that had driven me to this desolate, frozen lake shore, refused to yield. I needed to understand. I had to. The patterns coalesced, forming a single, vast design across the exposed face of the object. It wasn't a symbol I recognized, no ancient script or modern logo. It was a sprawling, interconnected network of lines and points, like a star chart, but one depicting constellations I had never seen, stars that burned with impossible colors. As I watched, mesmerized and horrified, the pattern began to deepen, to recede into the surface. It wasn't just two-dimensional anymore. It was as if I was looking through the object into something else entirely. The hum intensified, now a low thrum that vibrated through the soles of my boots, up my legs, into my skull. My teeth ached. My vision blurred at the edges, the pale sky seeming to stretch and warp. The object, this impossible thing, was pulling me in, drawing my focus, my very being, towards its fathomless depths. And then I saw it. The reveal. Within the receding patterns, beyond the star chart that wasn't a star chart, there was a space. A perfect, absolute blackness that swallowed the faint inner luminescence of the object. Not a physical movement, but a shift in perception, like the blink of an eye that was miles wide. A single, immense form, indistinct and featureless, yet undeniably there, began to resolve itself. It was vast, impossibly vast, filling the internal space I was peering into. It was like looking through a keyhole into another universe and finding something that shouldn't exist, something that defied scale and reason. It wasn't a creature with limbs or eyes. It was a presence. A silent, crushing weight that pressed down on my mind, not my body. It communicated nothing, offered no threat. Yet its sheer existence was an affront to everything I understood about life, about reality. It was a thing of pure, indifferent scale, an ancient, unknowable entity that had simply been for eons, uncaring of the fragile constructs of human understanding. My knees buckled, and I fell to the frozen ground, my fingers digging into the hard-packed snow and grit of the frozen lake shore. The hum became a roar in my head, the patterns on the object a swirling vortex of impossible color and form. I was seeing too much, understanding too little. My mind screamed for release, for a return to the mundane, the explainable. But the image, the presence within the object, was burned into my retinas, etched onto my soul. I wasn't looking at a rock. I was looking through it. And what lay beyond was not just empty space, but a terrifying, indifferent immensity that made my existence, made all human existence, seem like a fleeting whisper in an eternal, silent scream. The air around me grew heavy, not with physical weight, but with the crushing burden of impossible knowledge, something that had been waiting, and now it was awake. Instead of the clean, sharp crack I anticipated, the hammer simply sank, not through, not into soft earth, but into the object itself, as if its surface had momentarily become liquid. There was no resistance, no give, just a silent, effortless penetration of the dense, obsidian-like material. My knuckles brushed against the cold, smooth plane where the hammer's head had vanished. A sickening, impossible sensation. My fingers clenched around the handle, pulling back, and the hammer slid free with a soft, wet pop, leaving no mark, not even a scratch. A cold dread deeper than the biting wind began to unfurl in my gut. This wasn't stone. This wasn't metal. My mind, trained in the quantifiable, the observable, struggled to categorize the experience. The object hummed now, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated not in the air but directly against my teeth, through the soles of my boots. Then the surface of the embedded mass began to ripple, not like water but like heat haze above asphalt, twisting the pale light of the sky. The ripples intensified, growing deeper, pulling at the very fabric of my vision. The world around me started to distort. The jagged outline of the distant pines shimmered and stretched, their needles blurring into long, thin strokes of green. The ice on the lake, a solid, unyielding sheet moments before, now seemed to undulate, the frozen cracks shifting and reforming into impossible geometries. My grip tightened on the hammer, my grip tight. My eyes darted from the rippling surface of the object to the warping landscape. Was this real? Or was the strain of the past weeks finally taking its toll? I squeezed my eyes shut, counted to 3, and opened them again. The distortion remained, even intensified. The air itself tasted thin, metallic like ozone before a storm, but there was no storm. Only the relentless, silent hum from the object. The ripples on the object's surface began to coalesce, drawing together like ink in water, forming patterns. They weren't symbols, not exactly. They were more like the intricate, impossible fractals of a waking nightmare, shifting and reforming with an alien logic. And then within those patterns I saw it, or rather I understood it. It wasn't a reflection or a projection. It was a glimpse, a horrifying, unfiltered perception of the underlying chaos. What I had always perceived as the solid, immutable world, the sky, the ice, the trees, even my own hands, was not what it seemed. The colors I saw, the shapes I recognized, the very concept of up or down, they were all just filters. A thin, fragile membrane of perception that my mind, and every other mind, imposed upon the terrifying, boundless truth. The object wasn't an artifact, it was a breach. A shard of that membrane torn, exposing the raw, screaming reality that lay beneath. And my mind, unprepared, was trying to process it all at once. The silent hum intensified, becoming a roar that bypassed my ears and reverberated directly inside my skull, threatening to split it open. I saw the world as it truly was, not a collection of discrete objects, but an interconnected, pulsating web of pure, undifferentiated force, constantly creating and unmaking itself in a cycle too vast, too indifferent for any human consciousness to bear. My knees buckled. I fell to the frozen ground, my breath catching in my throat. All sensation was subsumed by the overwhelming flood of raw information. The individual snowflakes that danced in the wind were not distinct. They were momentary coalescences of the same swirling energy that formed the lake, the sky, the very air in my lungs. There was no separation, no me in them, only it. An endless, formless id asterisk. The implications crashed over me like an ice wave. Every memory, every belief, every moment of certainty I had ever held dissolved into the terrifying truth. We were not observers of a stable universe. We were participants in a collective, consensual hallucination, clinging to the illusion of form in order to maintain our sanity. And this object, this silent, humming blackness, was a tear in the veil. My hands flew to my head, pressing against my temples as if I could physically push the knowledge back, force the filters to re-engage. But the glimpse had been too profound. The truth had been seen, and it could not be unseen. The world was screaming, not with sound, but with the silent, relentless vibration of its own horrifying, formless existence. And I was now, irrevocably, a part of that scream. I was utterly alone, yet connected to everything, and the sheer, cosmic indifference of it all was the most horrifying revelation of my life.